Capacity can accommodate. And this is why we have bottlenecks and we have inflation pressures in some sectors, and other sectors have not completely normalized yet, which is very much due to the fact that this pandemic is not over yet, despite the vaccines and the good news on this front.
Yes, exactly. Now, Ewan, we obviously touched on the I word, inflation there, but I mean, how defensive do you think it's appropriate to be in this environment now?
I think we got to be prudent. Up to now, markets have seemed to discount a lot what could be described as bad news, and they have cheered up perhaps a little too much the good news. And one of the good news is the reassuring talks coming from the Fed, insisting that the inflationary pressures that we have right now are temporary in nature. And markets so far have accepted the general view that these inflationary pressures are temporary and that we will converge relatively soon to the 2% or something target that the Fed has and other central banks have. The problem, of course, Katie, is that temporary doesn't have a strict definition of how many months or quarters it means. And if we can invent something new, I think that we have right now temporary persistence, right? Seems to be contradictory, but we think that those inflationary pressures and those bottlenecks will continue well into 2022, and in some sectors it could go well into 2023 as well. So more prudence is needed, and I would say we can be in for some volatility, much more than we've seen over the last quarters.
Yeah, definitely. So Ewan, from the market's point of view, where is the volatility given all of this?
Yeah, well, I think there hasn't been a great deal of volatility as far as markets are concerned, and that's, I think, Martin touched on it. The central banks have been incredibly accommodative in terms of lowering interest rates, quantitative easing, and then on top of that, there's obviously been a colossal fiscal response from governments, which has settled everybody down, and there's an assumption that some of this is more, the fiscal support and so on is potentially more sustainable than in my view it is. And I think that's why the inflation question is so important, that can bond yields remain so low and help with governments spending money if inflation proves to be a persistent problem. So I would say volatility has been managed down. However, I do think we're living in times of unprecedented uncertainty. So the market's not showing it, but there's colossal uncertainty. And just, the inflation question, is it going to be persistent? I think there's a number of reasons why we should worry about that. One is that one of the drivers is obviously the COVID recovery. If that proves to be a very strong recovery, that in itself would put pressure. And I think given the level of fiscal expenditure, it's likely to be quite a strong bounce back unless we're blown off course by some dangerous variant. But of course, you've also got the deglobalization that's going on. It's China and the US both turning more domestic, and even possibly Europe starting to think about how it protects itself, resenting having that imbalance in terms of trade with China. And then, of course, you've got the drive to net zero. That can't be done without having consequences for energy prices and so on, which will impact on households. So I think there's a number of drivers that might cause us to worry about inflation. But apart from that, you've got geopolitics. Obviously, the withdrawal from Afghanistan and the message that sends to China, which was already being a bit more repressive internally and a bit more aggressive externally, all of a sudden it's got quite a bit of encouragement in its posture potentially towards the likes of Taiwan, because it doesn't think that the West will intervene. So I think geopolitics is going to be a cause for concern. which it really hasn't been in markets for quite some time. And then I think finally, my point is, because of the monetary support, the price of certain assets has got quite extended. So I call it the price of virtuous assets. So that's assets that seem to have the solutions or are well behaved from an ESG point of view, are getting priced quite expensively as people move maybe from passive indices that were market cap weighted towards indices that are tilted towards them. Whenever you move from a market cap index to a tilted index, you create bubbles because you can't sort of accommodate the amount of assets that are coming in without the price adjusting. And then the other assets that are priced for perfection are the perceived tech winners of the crisis. And so obviously they have done incredibly well. And that's been reinforced again by, for example, ETFs that are designed to invest in the winners. So you get these reinforcing things that go on for as long as they go on. But the question is, if interest rates were to rise or were to get some change in direction or inflation be a problem, some of those asset classes that, high growth asset classes that have been, or sectors, may get questioned quite fundamentally in that environment. So there's a lot to worry about, even though it's not showing through in volatility.
No, it's really not showing through. And Martin, I wanted to just come back to this question of inflation. I know you come from a central banking background. What tools do you have for analysing these supply chain pressures? Because we've never seen anything like it before. It strikes me that the modelling is quite poor. How do you come to understand it fully?
Oh, yeah, it's true. Uncertainty is, as Ewan said, one of the key words now. Because we've got at the same time going on structural changes that will be with us for years to come. And we have also a recovery process, which is characterized by lots of distortions. And to read through what is really temporary from what is really a matter of structural changes is a big challenge right now. But we're learning on the job, I would say, in order to be able to predict better what's going to happen. But if we come to inflationary pressures, the way I look at it from my point of view is that you got to look at the supply side of the economy, and what's happening in the global supply chains is a key for me. Nobody is clearly and completely out of this pandemic crisis, not even China. We used to say that China was first in, first out, but actually China can be and is still confronted from time to time to outbreaks of COVID, and it has to take its own measures. And we know that China has this zero tolerance policy, which works, but which at the same time can cause disruption in its own economy. And because of the central role that China is playing in global supply chains, it affects the rest of the world. But at the same time, you've got a lot of pressures coming from the demand side. In the US, you have a lot of policies of support. Fiscal expansion is unprecedented. We know it's temporary. In this particular case, these things will go away slowly, in some cases more abruptly, in some for some other measures. Demand will be coming down at some stage in the places where I have more bottlenecks. So that comforts my view that those pressures will be temporary. But temporary might be a year, might be a year and a half. It could be 2 years. And then the question is, how will markets react to this? Will they still accept the view that inflation is temporary in 3 months from now, in 6 months from now? Will the Fed have to move more quickly than everybody is discounting right now? Yes or no? So these are the uncertainties that we face. My view, though, is that valuation and leverage over the years adapt to the persistence of a low interest rate environment. Extremely difficult to move out of that low rate environment. So as far as real rates are concerned, my central prediction would be that they will remain very low for the future to come. The question is nominal rates, and it's got a lot to do with how the Fed will react if inflation is actually more persistent than it wants them to be, and that markets will continue to discount them to be.
I mean, you mentioned certain assets being priced to perfection, given this monetary and fiscal backdrop that we've just been hearing about. At what point is this complacency, and where are you seeing particular areas of excess?
Yeah, I mean, I think obviously in areas, sort of the obvious landmarks of assets like Tesla, and I've got no doubt electrification of cars is, electrification generally is going to be, a rising technology in a lot of economies over the next little while. The question is it going to be the only one? Also, the US stocks, they've got leadership. I think there's no question in sort of pure software and things like social media, payment apps, and other sort of what I would call maybe frivolous areas like, creation of Bitcoins and the exchanges to sell them. There's the leadership has gone to, US and China in those areas. I had a really interesting talk. I heard a really interesting talk recently, and it was from Roland Busch, who's the CEO of Siemens. And what he was posing was, as we move out of, kind of just pure software, and we have to connect the real economy with things like artificial intelligence. And he was talking about how Siemens in their trains, they now use technology to tell them, that a train door is going to fail 5 days before it fails, so they can replace the part before the door ever fails, that kind of thing. But he actually says in the Internet of Things, pure software isn't enough. You have to have the engineering capability to link technology and real stuff. And if we're going to get to net zero, we need real stuff to change. And that's where I think that maybe we need to turn our attention away from maybe more frivolous uses for technology towards real economy uses. And it could be that the engineering nations, Japan, Europe, have a chance. Now, they've been left behind by the rampant rise of the US, which is deemed to have tech leadership. I think we need to think about what does that mean and what are we going to reward in future. And I think it might be connecting it with the real economy. So that's certainly one of the things that we're thinking about. Just one other idea I'll throw out there is electrification and electric cars and things like that is a well-mined theme. I'm sure there's still a lot of money to be made from it. But, hydrogen as a fuel hasn't been explored so much. And there does seem to be something of a double standard in that people are quite happy to invest in electrification of cars. But, of course, when you charge your car, it is only as green as the grid in the country that you're charging it from. Whereas when hydrogen seems to need, people are really critical of the hydrogen, for example. It has to be green hydrogen. But surely it's a very big and expensive engineering project to fit things out and get aeroplanes onto using hydrogen as a fuel. I think we've got to start with whatever kind of hydrogen we get a hold of. And over time, hopefully, more of the hydrogen will turn green. So that's the sort of thing that certainly we're looking at Newton, trying to think what's going to take over, because the things that we already know about look like they're very well priced for what we already know.
Yeah. And just to stick with this technology theme a little longer, Ewan, you mentioned that the leadership of tech stocks is obvious, and you do see some particular clustering around names like Tesla. That kind of goes back to this theme of the narrowness of the recovery in markets and just the extent to which it's reliant on actually a pretty small clique of technology companies. Is this something to worry about in and of itself, or does it actually not matter?
It probably does matter. I mean, I think, Martin touched on, leverage, and leverage comes in a number of different formats. So one is, that obviously companies with, actually physically borrow more because they can, and interest rates are low and it costs them less to service their debt. So they're inclined to want to. So that's kind of the classical use of the word leverage. However, I think that because you've had this growth of ETFs and you've got platforms like Robinhood and so on, where people are investing, there tend to be, I think, the power of trend following and assets moving towards things that have done well is probably much more powerful than we realize. And so when some of these assets, whether it's Bitcoin, whether it's, a stock like Tesla, if it did hit a road bump and it was to go down materially, that the actual wealth destruction caused by it would probably be more than we anticipate.
Right. Yeah, this momentum is all well and good as long as it's heading in the right direction. I want to go back to the theme of China, Martin. We've spoken about this idea of first in, first out. There are now signs that the Chinese recovery, some of the steam is coming out of it. How much of a risk is that to the rest of the world?
Well, it's true that China is slowing, but it had to be expected, right? As we expected, the US will be slowing after this booming recovery that we've seen, which is in its current form simply unsustainable. So some form of a slowing of the Chinese economy had to be expected, and it is actually happening. In the long term, China is supposed to be slowing anyway because of demographic pressures, because it has already catched up a lot in terms of productivity levels vis-a-vis the more advanced countries. So we have to expect this slowing. Now, at this moment, that brings obviously some pressures out of the commodity markets. So it's not usually good news for exporters of commodity, but it's it's a short-term phenomenon, I would say. Ewan talked about electrification of transportation, about the infrastructure that will need to be developed in order to accommodate this in the energy sector in particular. So there will be booming demand for other commodities as we go into the next cycle. So it's a temporary phenomenon in this particular case. Now, China is the second largest economy. It is still, to my mind, an economy that is going overall than the US and the European economy. So the catching up will continue. It's only that it will continue at a lower speed. But it's still very much an important motor, not only of the recovery, but of the expansion in the next cycle. It will remain, even if we have, as Ewan mentioned, because of those geopolitical tensions, because of this China-US, China-Western world rivalry over key technologies. Globalization will be a different kind of globalization in the coming decade. Of course, it will be different. In that sense, there will be some, let's say, they will not completely part their ways, but they will not be as convergent as before. But even then, China will remain at the center of the world economy, to my mind.
Yeah. And can I move on to a slightly different theme, which is the housing market? We're seeing some enormous gains in house prices pretty much everywhere. Again, is this something to worry about? Is there an element of complacency here, do you think, Martin?
Well, it's certainly one area of concern in my own country here in Canada. Certainly, it's been for many years that I thought that at some point those pressures would slow at least, and that we would have something of the kind of a soft landing, but it never happens. And we've added to those pressures last year. I think that part of it, again, will not be sustained. We already see in Canada, at least, maybe in the US, it hasn't started yet, but certainly in Canada, it has started a bit, calmed down a little bit, not price-wise, though. But we see that there are normal constraints over how much people can pay, and obviously that will calm down. But it's a major challenge. But it's part also of the problems created by this low interest rate environment, this high liquidity environment that we are in. It's not only something that happened this year; it's something that we've been in for a decade. It's just continuing now. And you know what? Once you have injected so much liquidity, once the system has adapted to these low interest rates, it's very difficult to go back to where you were before. And you maintain a kind of equilibrium. It might not be comfortable, but you maintain a kind of equilibrium. And I think this is exactly where we are now. And it's got implications for distribution of assets and income across generations. And I think it's going to become increasingly a big issue for our societies. And we'll have to think about policies to address this.
Ewan, I see you nodding. What are your thoughts on this?
Well, I think Martin's touched on it. It's the kind of it's the obvious consequence of reducing interest rates, because very many people, when they think about the right price to pay for a home, think in terms of the monthly service bills that they've got to pay to service the debt. So very, very crudely, interest rates half, the price they're willing to pay doubles. That's kind of the mindset, unfortunately. But it means that those that had assets, and it doesn't really matter, to be honest, what assets people had, whether they owned the stock market, owned property, or even were kind of holding government debt, everything's done well. So generally, the people that have assets are those that are kind of 40 and over, and so you're getting this kind of social inequality between generations. And I do worry about these tensions between, there's so many different tensions at the minute. For example, development goals that most of us as investors will sign up to. One of them is to alleviate poverty. China's done a fantastic job of alleviating poverty. It's lifted literally, $1 billion or so out of crushing poverty, but it's now emitting half of the world's carbon dioxide, because when people become less poor, they obviously want to drive cars and fly around the world. And so you've got these competing things. I understand why central banks wanted to lower interest rates and sort of keep the economy going, but I don't think anybody was thinking hard enough about the social inequality that was going to cause, and didn't have the right policies to prevent it. So that can, deep social unrest wrecks economies. And so that's something we should be worried about.
On a different note, again, another side effect, if you like, of super low interest rates is that it's increasingly pushing asset managers into private markets. What's your stance on that?
Well, I mean, in the firm I'm in, we don't invest a great deal in private assets. We have participated more recently in a sort of private equity deal, but it's quite a small part of what we do. The previous firm I was in was more involved in private debt and infrastructure and so on. I mean, my view is that it's a pity that companies are kind of not willing to come into the public markets, and I do think we need to make sure we've got regulations and disclosures at the right level, because again, I think it's one of these situations that you get with a number of fund managers because of the pressure to comply with, or to be seen to be a good sustainable manager, and we would like to be seen in that way. But you come under pressure to exclude certain assets and so on. But what you exclude is still in the world, and private companies that are destroying the environment have less visibility than those that are in the public market, but they potentially are doing more damage. So I think I understand why certain industries and sectors prefer to be private. But I think it's, the listed market needs to think about why are we not attracting these assets into a sort of more publicly available arena.
Yeah, it's an interesting point. We're coming towards the end of our discussion, so I want to ask Martin, how optimistic are you? Would you describe yourself as an optimist at this stage?
Well, overall, I'm optimistic, I would say. First of all, think about it, right? We still have problems, of course, and I said that the pandemic was not over, but could have we imagined just a year ago how quickly we could develop vaccines and have a return of a kind of a normality for many, many aspects of our lives, right? It's not yet exactly what it used to be, but it's much better than a year ago. And this makes me optimistic. The other thing that makes me optimistic is that we've learned some of the lessons of the last crisis, and I'm thinking of Europe in particular. In this case, I don't expect any kind of financial crisis or euro crisis like the one we had after 2008 and 2009, because the Europeans have got their act together and found ways of working together towards a solution. It's not perfect, but it's a huge improvement. So I'm optimistic. And the last reason why I would be optimistic is that this crisis, despite all the problems that it's still creating and the suffering that it's creating, has also a virtue. It's accelerating technological change. It's accelerating the digitalization of some sectors that have been a little maybe complacent, and they had to invest. They didn't do it before. They're doing it right now. So there is the potential for accelerating the kind of clean growth, a growth which is more respectful of the environment. Policies also are evolving in this sense. Create a more productive environment in which we will also achieve some of our goals in terms of fighting climate change, etc. So a lot of challenges ahead. Let's be realistic. Let's not be naive. But there are good reasons also to be optimistic.
Ewan, what do you think? Do you think that is there too much optimism baked into the market right now? You do hear increasing doubts about the sustainability of where markets have got to at this point.
Yes, I think some sectors, and some we've touched on them. You know, the sort of whether it's the virtuous leaders that are on a high price, or the tech leaders that are on a high price. I do think there's going to be at some point a fair amount of wealth destruction. I can't see, I recognise that Bitcoin is some limited supply, but something like Dogecoin, which has got unlimited supply, I don't know why it's worth anything. And so I think there's going to be a lot of value destruction in areas like crypto and so on. Having said that, I'm optimistic because I'm an active manager and I can direct capital towards areas that I still think have got value, like Internet of Things, and into some of the industries that are adapting to maybe hydrogen as a fuel. The other thing is simply income equity, using equities for income rather than growth, is attractively priced at the minute, particularly if you believe, as Martin does and I believe, that there's going to be a policy of not raising interest rates too quickly, regardless of how persistent inflation is, because nobody wants to countenance that. So having a portfolio of equities where you believe the dividend's sustainable and maybe the firm has some pricing power in the face of inflation, it's not going to necessarily deliver spectacular returns, but 3-4% plus some protection against inflation, I think, is going to be an outstanding return over the next 10-15 years.
And just quickly, since you were brave enough to bring up crypto, in the event that there is wealth destruction in this sector, for want of a better word, does that hurt global markets, or would it be a controlled explosion, do you think?
I think it's one of these things that I touched on earlier, kind of with leverage or, levering up bets and so on, you just don't know where it's going to appear. And so if it does blow up, you might find that some, more mainstream actors are suddenly more exposed to it than anyone anticipated.
Yeah, when the tide goes out, we'll see. That's the only way to find out who's left holding the baby. Right?
Who had one swimsuit, right? As used to say the former Fed chairman, I guess.
Yes, yeah, exactly. In the meantime, it's at the very least a fascination for the rest of us. We're going to have to wrap up our discussion there. Martin, Ewan, thank you for your fascinating thoughts this afternoon or this morning, or depending on where you are. We're going to have to wrap up, but thanks ever so much for listening and thanks for taking part.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.